For most Americans and Canadians, the morning started like any other. Coffee brewing, traffic building, factories opening their doors, truck drivers preparing another run across one of the busiest trading borders on Earth. But then a headline began spreading through newsrooms, business circles, and manufacturing communities. Donald Trump was signaling that a new review of the USMCA trade agreement could become a major priority. At first glance, it sounded like another political story, another negotiation, another campaign promise, something that would be debated in Washington and Ottawa before eventually fading from the headlines. But for people whose livelihoods depend on North American trade, the announcement felt very different. In Ohio, a 62-year-old auto parts worker named Tom read the news before starting his shift. For more than 3 decades, he had watched factories close, reopen, relocate, and adapt. He had heard promises before, promises that jobs would return, promises that manufacturing would come home, promises that trade agreements could be rewritten to favor American workers. This time, he wanted to believe it. Hundreds of miles away in Windsor, Ontario, another worker named David saw the same headline. He had spent much of his career inside a supply chain tied directly to the United States. For years, the assumption had been simple. If America bought Canada, prospered. If America slowed down, Canada felt the impact almost immediately. Now he wondered whether another trade confrontation was beginning. And if it was, what would happen to communities like his. Because this story is not really about politics. It is not even about tariffs. It is about something much larger. It is about a trading relationship worth roughly $1.3 trillion. A relationship that supports factories, farms, energy projects, rail networks, ports, small businesses, and millions of jobs on both sides of the border. And today, that relationship appears to be entering another period of uncertainty. Why now? Why reopen an agreement that was already renegotiated only a few years ago? And why are some officials in Ottawa appearing surprisingly calm despite the growing political noise coming from Washington? Those questions matter because the economic landscape of 2026 looks very different from the one that existed during the last trade battle. America faces growing competition abroad. Its manufacturing ambitions are expanding. Its debt burden continues to rise. And policymakers are searching for ways to strengthen domestic industry while protecting strategic supply chains. At the same time, Canada is not standing still. Quietly and often with little public attention, Ottawa has been making decisions that could reshape how the country approaches trade, investment, energy, and critical minerals. The result is a situation that few people fully understand. Washington believes it may have leverage. Ottawa believes it may have options. And somewhere between those two positions lies the future of North American trade. If this story deserves more attention, help keep it visible and stay with us. Because what happens next could determine whether Canada becomes even more dependent on the American market, or whether it emerges from this challenge with more strategic flexibility than many in Washington expected. And what looked like another political headline was actually exposing a much deeper problem. The relationship between Canada and the United States is often described as one of the closest economic partnerships in the world. But that description does not fully capture how deeply connected the two countries have become, because what exists today is not simply trade. It is a shared economic system, and that difference matters. When many people think about international trade, they imagine one country producing a product and another country buying it. A simple transaction. A seller and a customer. But North America no longer works that way. Consider something as ordinary as a pickup truck. The aluminum may come from Quebec. The steel could come from Ontario. Components may be manufactured in Michigan. Electronic systems may be assembled in Ohio. Some parts cross the border multiple times before the vehicle is finally completed. Every crossing adds value. Every supplier depends on another supplier. Every factory depends on another factory. What appears to be one industry is actually a vast network stretching across thousands of communities. That network took decades to build. And because it took decades to build, it cannot be replaced overnight. Tom understands this reality better than most. Over the years, he watched production methods change. Machines became more advanced. Supply chains became more global. Competition became more intense. Yet one thing remained remarkably consistent. The Canadian border never felt far away. Many of the parts used inside his factory depended on companies operating north of the border. Most workers never thought much about it. The system simply worked, until politics entered the equation. And that is where the challenge begins. Because governments often focus on national interests. Businesses focus on efficiency. Workers focus on stability. Those priorities do not always align. A tariff may sound simple during a political speech. A rule change may sound reasonable during a campaign event. But inside a supply chain, every adjustment creates consequences. A small increase in costs becomes a larger increase elsewhere. A delayed shipment becomes a production slowdown. A production slowdown becomes uncertainty. And uncertainty often becomes postponed investment. That is why business leaders on both sides of the border pay such close attention whenever trade agreements are reopened. The concern is not always about the policy itself. The concern is what happens afterward. Because markets dislike uncertainty. Investors dislike uncertainty. Employers dislike uncertainty. And workers often feel the effects first. In Windsor, David began hearing familiar conversations. People talked about tariffs. People talked about negotiations. People talked about possible changes to auto manufacturing rules. But beneath those conversations was a deeper concern. Would companies delay future investments until they knew the outcome? Would expansion plans be postponed? Would employers wait before making long-term commitments? Nobody knew, and uncertainty has a way of spreading faster than facts. For communities that depend on manufacturing, uncertainty can become its own economic force. Families delay major purchases. Businesses become cautious. Local economies begin slowing long before any official policy takes effect. But something else was happening beneath the surface. While public attention focused on tariffs and trade disputes, executives inside major industries were examining a different question. What if the greatest risk was not Canada? What if the greatest risk was disruption itself? Because many American companies had spent years building integrated supply chains across North America. Breaking those connections would not automatically create new factories. It would not automatically create new jobs. And it certainly would not happen quickly. The reality was becoming difficult to ignore. The economic relationship between Canada and the United States had become so interconnected that pressure applied to one side often created consequences for the other, which raised an uncomfortable question. If Washington wanted to rewrite the rules of trade once again, was it fully prepared for the economic chain reaction that might follow? The public debate focused on tariffs, but the real vulnerability was hidden somewhere else. To understand why Washington may be preparing for another major trade confrontation, we first need to understand something happening far beyond the Canadian border. Because Canada is not the main challenge facing the United States today. China is. Global competition is. And the race to rebuild American manufacturing has become one of the defining economic goals of the decade. For years, policymakers in Washington watched factories move overseas. Entire industrial communities were transformed. Supply chains stretched across continents. Critical industries became increasingly dependent on foreign suppliers. Then came the shocks. The pandemic exposed vulnerabilities. Global shipping disruptions exposed vulnerabilities. Geopolitical tensions exposed vulnerabilities. Suddenly, supply chains were no longer viewed as purely economic issues. They became national security issues. And that changed the conversation. Across Washington, a new consensus began to emerge. America needed more manufacturing, more domestic production, more control over critical industries, more resilience. That objective is supported by Republicans and Democrats alike, even if they disagree on how to achieve it. For Donald Trump, the solution has often centered on leverage. Use tariffs, renegotiate agreements, pressure trading partners, create incentives for companies to bring production back to American soil. From that perspective, reopening parts of the USMCA makes political sense. Supporters argue that stricter rules could encourage more investment inside the United States. They argue that American workers deserve stronger protections. They argue that America should maximize every advantage available to strengthen its industrial base. For workers like Tom in Ohio, those arguments are appealing. After all, he has seen what economic decline looks like. He remembers factories that once employed thousands. He remembers restaurants filled with shift workers. He remembers communities that seemed economically secure. Then came years of uncertainty. Some businesses survived. Others disappeared. So when politicians promise to bring jobs home, people listen. Not because they are naive, but because they have lived through the alternative. Yet what sounds straightforward in a political speech often becomes much more complicated in the real world. Because modern manufacturing no longer operates within neat national boundaries. The auto industry is a perfect example. Many vehicles assembled in America rely on Canadian materials. Many Canadian factories rely on American customers, and many suppliers operate facilities in both countries simultaneously. Changing one part of the system affects everything connected to it. Business leaders understand this. Investors understand this, and increasingly policymakers understand it as well. That is why many companies are quietly preparing for multiple outcomes. Some are hoping for limited changes. Others are preparing contingency plans. A few are delaying major decisions until the political picture becomes clearer. And that is where the first unexpected consequence begins to appear. Not in factories, not in ports, not in government offices, but in boardrooms, because uncertainty has a cost. When executives do not know what future trade rules will look like, investment decisions often slow down. Expansion plans are postponed. Hiring plans are reconsidered. Capital waits on the sidelines. The economic damage does not arrive all at once. It arrives gradually, quietly, almost invisibly. Tom began noticing small signs. Management discussions became more cautious. Long-term planning conversations became less certain. Nobody was talking about layoffs. Nobody was talking about shutdowns. But confidence was no longer as strong as it had been. And confidence matters, because businesses invest when they feel secure about the future. They hesitate when they do not. Meanwhile, something surprising was happening north of the border. While Washington was publicly discussing pressure tactics and trade leverage, officials in Ottawa seemed unusually measured, not relaxed, not unconcerned, but prepared, almost as if they had anticipated this possibility long before it became a headline, which raises an important question. What exactly had Canada been doing while Washington focused on rewriting the rules? Because the answer may explain why some people in Ottawa appear far less worried than many observers expected. And that is where the story becomes far more interesting. Because Ottawa had been watching these pressures build for years. For months, much of the discussion surrounding a possible USMCA review focused on what Washington might do next. Would tariffs return? Would auto rules become stricter? Would dairy disputes escalate again? Would another trade fight emerge between two of the world's closest economic partners? Those were reasonable questions. But they may not have been the most important questions. Because while political attention remained focused on Washington, something quieter was happening inside Canada. Something that received far less media attention. Something that may ultimately prove more important than any single trade negotiation. Preparation. Not preparation for a specific tariff. Not preparation for a specific political leader. Preparation for a world where Canada could no longer assume the United States would always remain a predictable economic partner. This is where Mark Carney enters the story. Carney understands something that many politicians struggle to accept. Canada cannot compete with America on size. It cannot compete on population. It cannot compete on military power. And it cannot compete on the scale of its domestic market. The numbers are simply too different. But Carney also understands another reality. Countries do not always win through size. Sometimes they win through positioning. And positioning may become Canada's greatest advantage during the next decade. Because the global economy is changing. The world is becoming increasingly hungry for three things: reliable energy, critical minerals, and secure supply chains. Canada happens to possess all three. For years, many Canadians viewed the country's natural resources as ordinary economic assets: oil, natural gas, nickel, copper, lithium, rare earth elements. But global governments increasingly view these resources differently. They see strategic assets, the building blocks of future industries. the foundation of electric vehicles, artificial intelligence infrastructure, defense manufacturing, advanced technology production. And the competition for those resources is becoming more intense every year. That shift may explain why Ottawa appears less alarmed than some observers expected, because Canada is no longer looking at trade solely through the lens of exports. It is increasingly looking at trade through the lens of leverage. Not aggressive leverage, not retaliatory leverage, strategic leverage. The ability to offer something the world needs. And that changes the conversation. David began noticing signs of this transformation in Ontario. Several years earlier, many workers assumed Canada's economic future would continue following a familiar pattern. Extract resources, sell products to America. Repeat. Simple, predictable, stable. But increasingly, new conversations were emerging. Battery facilities, critical mineral projects, electric vehicle investments, technology infrastructure, foreign capital looking for long-term opportunities. The changes were gradual. Many Canadians barely noticed them. Yet, together they pointed toward something larger. A country attempting to reduce risk by creating more options. And options matter, because dependence creates vulnerability. The more dependent a country becomes on a single customer, a single market, or a single trading partner, the less flexibility it has when conditions change. Carney appears to understand this deeply, which may explain why Canada has been expanding economic relationships beyond North America. Europe is becoming increasingly important. Asian markets are becoming increasingly important. Strategic partnerships are becoming increasingly important. The objective is not replacing the United States. That would be unrealistic. America will remain Canada's largest trading partner for the foreseeable future. The objective is something more subtle, more practical, and potentially more effective. Reducing exposure. Creating alternatives. Building resilience, because resilience creates negotiating power, and negotiating power creates confidence. What makes this strategy particularly interesting is that it does not require confrontation. Canada does not need to defeat America. Canada does not need to outgrow America. Canada simply needs enough alternatives to avoid being cornered. That distinction may become critically important if future trade disputes emerge. Because countries with options negotiate differently from countries without options. And this is where Washington may be facing a challenge that did not exist during earlier trade battles. The Canada of 2026 is not exactly the same Canada that entered previous negotiations. Global demand for energy has changed. Global demand for critical minerals has changed. Investment patterns have changed. Supply chain priorities have changed. And geopolitical realities have changed, which means both sides may be approaching the next round of negotiations with very different assumptions. Washington may see leverage. Ottawa may see opportunity. And somewhere between those two perspectives lies a question that could shape the future of North American trade. What happens when both sides believe they are holding stronger cards than before, but the real concern was still hidden beneath the surface? Because the next vulnerability was not about trade agreements at all. It was about something far more difficult to replace. At first glance, the debate surrounding a possible USMCA review appears to be about tariffs, trade rules, and manufacturing. But those issues may only be scratching the surface, because beneath the political arguments lies a much deeper reality. The United States and Canada are no longer simply trading partners. They have become strategic dependencies. And that creates a vulnerability neither side can easily escape. For decades, many Americans viewed Canada as a reliable supplier, a friendly neighbor, a stable partner, a country that would always be there when resources were needed. And for many years, that assumption appeared reasonable. Canada supplied energy. Canada supplied raw materials. Canada supplied critical inputs that helped power American industry. The arrangement worked so well that few people stopped to consider what would happen if those connections were disrupted. Not permanently, just enough to create uncertainty. That is where the real vulnerability begins. Take electricity. Millions of Americans rarely think about where their power comes from. They flip a switch and expect the lights to turn on. Yet parts of the United States rely heavily on electricity imported from Canada. The same is true for energy products moving through pipelines and transportation networks built over generations. Most of the time, those systems operate quietly, almost invisibly, until politics enters the conversation. Then suddenly assets that once seemed ordinary begin looking strategically important. The same pattern appears in critical minerals. Washington wants more domestic manufacturing, more electric vehicles, more advanced technology production, more AI infrastructure. All of those ambitions require enormous quantities of raw materials. Nickel, lithium, copper, rare earth elements. Many of those resources are available in Canada, and developing alternative supply chains takes years, not months. That means replacing Canada is far easier to discuss than to accomplish. But the vulnerability does not belong exclusively to America. Canada faces its own challenges. Its economy remains deeply connected to American demand. Many Canadian industries still depend on access to U.S. markets. Countless jobs depend on economic stability south of the border. That creates a delicate balance. Neither side can easily walk away. Neither side can easily replace the other. And that reality makes every negotiation more complicated. David understood this better than ever. At a local coffee shop in Windsor, conversations increasingly centered on uncertainty. Not fear, not panic, just uncertainty. People wondered whether future investments would continue arriving, whether manufacturers would expand, whether political tensions would affect long-term planning. Most workers were not studying trade agreements. They were thinking about mortgages, retirement savings, their children, their communities. The human consequences of economic uncertainty often appear long before official economic damage becomes visible. A family delays purchasing a vehicle. A business delays hiring. A manufacturer delays expansion. None of those decisions make national headlines. Yet together they quietly slow economic momentum. That is the silent damage policymakers rarely discuss. Not collapse, not crisis, hesitation. And hesitation can spread through an economy faster than many people realize. Meanwhile, another challenge was beginning to emerge. The race for strategic resources was accelerating around the world. Europe wanted secure supply chains. Japan wanted reliable partners. Major investors wanted politically stable jurisdictions. Suddenly, countries rich in energy and critical minerals found themselves holding increasingly valuable assets. That trend may become one of the most important economic stories of the next decade, because future competition may not be defined solely by who manufactures products. It may be defined by who controls the resources needed to manufacture them, and that possibility changes the entire calculation. A decade ago, Canada often worried about being too dependent on the United States. Today, a new question is quietly emerging. Could the United States eventually become more dependent on Canadian strategic resources than many Americans currently realize? The answer remains uncertain, but uncertainty itself is becoming a powerful force. Because pressure applied to a deeply interconnected system rarely produces a simple result. It produces reactions, countermoves, unexpected adjustments, and sometimes entirely new opportunities. What happened quietly afterward changed the entire calculation, because the effects did not stop at the border. They were already beginning to reshape decisions around the world. By the time trade negotiations eventually begin, the outcome may already be influencing decisions far beyond Washington and Ottawa. Because global investors rarely wait for politicians to finish negotiating. They position themselves early. They look for trends before they become obvious. And increasingly they are asking a different question. If North America enters another period of economic uncertainty, where should future investment go? The answer may reshape entire industries. Mexico is already attracting attention from manufacturers seeking access to the North American market. European companies are searching for reliable suppliers of critical minerals and energy. Japanese firms continue looking for long-term partnerships capable of supporting advanced manufacturing and technology production. And global capital is moving toward countries that can provide stability in an increasingly unstable world. What started as a discussion about trade rules is becoming something much larger. A competition for investment, a competition for resources, a competition for future industrial growth. And that may be the hidden consequence few people considered when discussions about reopening the USMCA first began, because trade agreements do more than govern commerce. They influence confidence, and confidence influences where billions of dollars eventually flow. Tom began to notice this shift in a way that felt familiar. For years, economic discussions focused on jobs, factories, production numbers. Now, another factor was entering the conversation: competition for investment. His community still wanted manufacturing growth, still wanted economic stability, still wanted opportunity. But increasingly, success depended on attracting future projects rather than simply protecting existing ones. That reality was becoming clear across much of America. Meanwhile, David was witnessing a different conversation unfold in Ontario. People were still concerned about trade tensions, still watching developments in Washington carefully. But there was also growing discussion about opportunities that barely existed a decade earlier: battery supply chains, critical mineral development, energy infrastructure, artificial intelligence investments, new export markets. None of these opportunities guaranteed success, but they represented something important: options. And options change how countries think about the future. This may be where Mark Carney's leadership becomes especially significant. Not because he can eliminate economic pressure. No leader can. Not because he can make Canada independent from the United States. That is neither realistic nor desirable. But because he appears focused on a more achievable goal: building resilience, creating alternatives, expanding strategic flexibility, preparing Canada for a world that is becoming more competitive, more fragmented, and less predictable. That approach may not generate dramatic headlines. It may not produce immediate results. But long-term economic strategy rarely works overnight. Its success is often measured years later, sometimes decades later. And that may be why Ottawa's response to growing trade uncertainty appears calmer than many observers expected. The objective is not to win a trade war. The objective is to ensure Canada remains strong regardless of how the trade dispute unfolds. If you worked in manufacturing, energy, transportation, or any industry affected by cross-border trade, I would genuinely like to hear your perspective in the comments below. Because for many people, these issues are not political debates. They are personal realities. But the real pressure may still be ahead, because what happens over the next few years could determine how North America's economic map looks by the end of this decade. And if you follow Canada-U.S. trade stories, closely subscribe and stay with us for the next report. Because this story is far from over. In the end, neither Tom nor David knows exactly how the next chapter will unfold. Neither do policymakers. Neither do investors. The future remains uncertain. But one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The Canada emerging today is not simply reacting to pressure. It is adapting to it. The United States remains an economic giant. Canada remains the smaller partner. That reality is unlikely to change. But history has shown that smaller nations do not survive by matching giants step for step. They survive by thinking carefully, by adapting early, and by building strengths others underestimate. Perhaps that is the real story behind the coming USMCA review. Not whether one side defeats the other, but whether both countries can adapt to a world that is changing faster than either expected. And if Canada's future matters to you, stay part of this conversation. Because smaller nations rarely get easy choices in a changing world. Yet their future is often shaped by how wisely they respond when those choices arrive.